right, díolí bar fad agus tá míle fáilte roimh. I've spent my day welcoming people here because we've just had our annual Harp Makers Symposium here all day. And I spent my day welcoming them. Upstairs, we've had a very historic concert at the Irish Chamber Orchestra. And now we're here at an equally historic and very special occasion where we're welcoming Toner Quinn, who's a very important person in the world of harping. And I see here in the front row another very important person in the world of harping, Nicholas Carolan, because both of these people have been involved at seminal moments for harping in Ireland, with the establishment of Harp Ireland in 2016-17. Toner was intimately involved in that because he was the author of the 2014 Arts Council report on the harping tradition in Ireland. Why Nicholas is so important is that Nicholas for many years was an authority on the collections, the music collections of the harpers. And in 2010, Nicholas facilitated I would say, a major event at the International Festival for Irish Harp on Cruit in Termonfeckin in County Louth, where we actually sat down and had roundtable discussions about the future of harping in Ireland, which we had never done before. So you're very welcome to this very special historic occasion, because on the occasion of the 10th anniversary, I can't believe it's 10 years since Toner's report in 2014, and also on the occasion of the report on the traditional arts in 2004, which was also commissioned by the Arts Council, which I suppose saw Irish music take its rightful place in terms of state funding and what state funding should be doing for the traditional arts. We will always say there isn't enough, but Toner you were the facilitator for that committee meeting, weren't you, Toner, at that time? So that's why it's so important for us to have Toner here today. And I was saying to Toner when we were discussing the theme of this lecture, Toner, it has to be something about harping, but I really want you to challenge all of the rest as well and to tell us where you think we are going, but also where you think Irish music in general is going within the current parameters and framework that we are. So Toner, I'm not going to give you any more of his biog details other than to say that he's the author of a very special book of essays on Irish music. He is a musician in his own right. He's the editor of the Journal of Music of Ireland. He has published a book on Desmond Fennell. He has also a recording with Malachy Burke, the fiddle player, called The Steeple. And it's with great pleasure that I mention him, that I welcome him here today for our Lecht Vlientúil on What's Next for Irish Music, presented by Cruit, Éireann, Harp Ireland. And can I give you Toner Quinn, please?
Well, okay. Gurmina Mahagat, Éireann, Agus Lauren, Agus Shauna, Agus Cruit, Éireann, Harp Ireland, as Gura, Vehan Shahanya, Div Hard, Agus, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here to deliver the Cruit, Éireann, Harp Ireland lecture for 2024 and to mark 10 years since the report on the harping tradition in Ireland, which I completed and submitted in maybe 6 or 8 months or something like that to the Arts Council in October 2014. When Éireann said to me it had been 10 years, I was sure she was mistaken, but here we are. So it was a 96-page report. It had 14 recommendations about the future of the Irish harp, and I'll talk shortly a little about what happened after it was published. But the title of this lecture is What's Next for Irish Music? And I can't believe I gave myself such a challenging title, but it makes it interesting for me as well to think about these things. So I also want to speak afterwards about what I think are 3 significant developments, and I'm going to focus on 3, that have the potential to affect the future of Irish music in a positive way, but which we cannot take for granted either. And of course, any positive developments in the music scene will generally also affect the harp as well in a positive way. And I should mention, as Éireann just briefly mentioned there, that the Harp report 10 years ago was not the first report that I wrote for the Arts Council. It was the second major policy shift in music in Ireland that I was involved in. The first being the report of the Special Committee on the Traditional Arts. I know you all want one of those today, don't you? A special committee in charge of everything. it was set up by the government and the Arts Council, and that report was called Towards a Policy for the Traditional Arts. I was the project officer, and very soon the late Jerome Hines, he was the chair, he put me to work writing. There was a split in the committee the very day I started. It was much more fraught than the Harp report. But what we were trying to do in that first report in 2004, as with the Harp report in 2014, was simply to show, in my mind, show the many different components that go into our music scene, into our Irish music scene. There can be an idea, and I've heard this over the years, that music in Ireland just happens. It's meant to be a compliment, but actually this phrase pops up with politicians and economists and commentators, that music just happens in Ireland, like it comes from the sky, or it grows up from the ground. And it underestimates the huge voluntary effort that goes in to make music in Ireland just happen. So we had to win that argument in 2004 and again in 2014. I think we did to a certain extent, and I think we've seen the benefits of that. But that's a really, really important argument that we keep having to make. So the combination of those two reports together, 2004, 2014, I can see now, 20 years later, what an extraordinary opportunity it was to shift the Arts Council's and the state's understanding of music forward in a significant way and in a relatively short space of time. That's really what jumps out about it now. When things were not quite as bureaucratic as they are today, and you could move faster, and there was a real sense of urgency back then, a real sense of urgency. I realize now also that I was 30 when I wrote that first report for the Arts Council Towards a Policy for the Traditional Arts, and I was 40 when I wrote the Harp report, and now I'm 50. And I'm not writing a report this year, okay? But I am definitely writing more than I was ever writing in my life, because there is so much to write about. Now, in Harp years, 50 is not much at all. This tradition is a millennium old, and we are in Harp years this evening, so 50 is okay. Now, when Éireann asked me to give this talk, I had to really reflect hard. Of course, I said, yes, that sounds great. I'd love to do it. And then I had to really think hard and ask myself a difficult question. What have I learnt over the past 10 years since the Harp report, 20 years since the Traditional Arts report, and even more than that, 25 years of writing about music in Ireland? What have I actually learnt? I had to think hard, because when you run a magazine, and I published the online publication, the Journal of Music, everything comes across your desk. Absolutely everything. All the announcements, all the strategies, all the reports, all the press releases, as well as all the news from musicians and artists, and then all of the private conversations as well, that I can't repeat, and that always would start with, don't quote me on this, but. And all of those are coming across my desk all the time, and I'm always thinking about them, and there's so much happening, it can take a while for patterns to emerge, or to be able to see clearly. But I have learned, firstly, I'm going to tell you what I've learned, and this will be no comfort to you whatsoever. I have learned that it is usually, when it comes to the music and the arts in Ireland, it is usually not going to develop the way you thought it would. Now, that may not be a revelation to you, but given the amount of planning that takes place, you would think it would. But there are genuine, even positive reasons for that. Firstly, it is a dynamic scene. It is a remarkable scene that we have. I was in Armagh last night at the Armagh, the William Kennedy Piping Festival. We went from Irish traditional music to Iranian pipes to everything. It's just an extraordinary scene, no matter where you go. And I travel a lot to festivals, and it always strikes me as remarkable. But because it is such a dynamic music scene that we have, with new ideas and new talent and new generations coming up all the time, with new demands and new perspectives, and they want change, and they want to see change quickly, things change rapidly in this music scene. And I often think of myself, not as a magazine editor at all, but as some kind of scientist, a geothermal scientist, moving around, just actually following this energy in this music scene, because it moves from genre to genre. There's something popping up there. That's actually not part of the plan. Okay, right. I've got to hold this up away from it. It makes it very difficult, this really fast-moving scene. It makes it very difficult for state departments and state arts organisations to react fast enough to it. And so that creates a lot of frustration. It creates this general low hum of annoyance in the art sector amongst artists. And I understand that challenge. At the same time, the other thing I have learned is that state departments and state organisations, they often have their own plans, which are completely separate to what actually the artists are looking for. And they can get very excited about those plans, and they take off, and they have the resources to actually put them into action, regardless of whether anybody asked for them or wants them. And I notice sometimes that they see music and the arts not as artists, creativity, but as some kind of resource, like a mine, that we can draw upon for wider political, economic, and social aims. So the general picture today, as it was before in the past, is a lot of competing priorities and perspectives. It is a constant competition. And the situation sometimes benefits artists and sometimes it doesn't. Unfortunately, that gives me an awful lot to write about. Now, what is interesting about the harp, in amongst all of these competing priorities, over the past 10 and 20 years, is that there has been some extraordinary progress. And the credit here, there was the Harp report, there was the Arts Council investment, but the credit here really has to go to the Harp community and Harp Ireland since 2016, who have seized the opportunity. The Arts Council and the Harp report help along the way, but it was a community movement and a powerful community movement at that. One of the key recommendations of the report was that the various harp organisations would come together and establish an Irish Harp Forum. This is one of the recommendations I made in 2014, an umbrella group. And Cruit, Éireann, Harp Ireland was established in 2016, just 2 years after the report. That is lightning speed in bureaucracy. Another extraordinary achievement, of course, was just 5 years after the Harp report in 2019. There was a campaign led by Éireann McCrannan, Harp Ireland, achieved UNESCO status for the Irish harping tradition. A lot of you will be aware of that, but that is an extraordinary achievement. It was inscribed, Irish harping was inscribed on the representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. This not only raised the profile of harping nationally and internationally, it was in all the media here, but it also gave it a layer of safeguarding that can protect it into the future. That was a great achievement, and that wasn't one of the recommendations in my report to go and get UNESCO status. But it was an incredible thing that the community did. Another area where things have really changed in the profile of the harp that I've seen over the past 10 years is in what I say, the profile. When I was researching the harp report, the diversity of the scene was what jumped out at me. This was what was exciting about it. There were so many sides to it because the tradition was so old. There was modern Irish harping, early Irish harping, different techniques, different repertoire, experimentalism, differing opinions. I loved the energy. It was a real strength because it made it a living tradition. But despite all these differences in the harp community 10 years ago, there was one thing that they all agreed upon. Literally just one thing. And it was the low profile and the outdated image of the Irish harp, and that this was a barrier to progress. You know, the cliche of the Irish colleen playing in front of a thatched cottage, that was the old image of the harp. And if you actually saw The Butcher Boy last Sunday on TV, I don't know if anybody saw that, but Sinead O'Connor plays a harper outside a thatched cottage in a hallucinatory scene. So that image is still there and being projected out there. But everyone in harping agreed that this outdated image was a stumbling block and that it didn't reflect the reality of the exciting scene that we had. And that was encapsulated in things like Riverdance. There was no harp in Riverdance, for example. There was no harp at the Caelura concert at the Royal Albert Hall when Michael D. Higgins visited for the first state visit to Britain. So these were kind of significant milestones that encapsulated that kind of marginalisation of the harp, which is extraordinary given that it was such an iconic symbol in Ireland. But things have really changed. And I want to show you a video which I came across recently, and in a very simple sense, it just shows just how the profile and reach of the Irish harp has changed in Ireland. This video dates from 2 years ago. I'm not going to say anything about it. I'm just going to show it to you. Let's see. And I'll talk about it afterwards. There's no sound. Press volume. There we go. Isn't that quite a change for the harp in 2022? This is that was Gemma Doherty. That was an extract from Bono's book tour that he did in 2022 for his memoir, Surrender. And there were just 3 musicians on stage when he toured Europe and the States, and one of them was the Derry harper, Gemma Doherty, from the band Saint Sister. And in this video, he's playing on CBS to 2 million people, and that's how to change people's view of an instrument. But that's an extraordinary change as far as I can see. When you see this kind of performance, this instrument has moved out of a corner of traditional Irish music and has moved into the mainstream. And Gemma Doherty, she was supported by Harp Ireland this year to do a residency at the Tyrone Guthrie Centre. And that's why you need resource organisations to actually make these connections and take these talented artists and give them opportunities like that. Gemma Doherty is playing the modern Irish harp there, but this new profile is not just affecting the modern Irish harp. The early Irish harp has also raised its profile, which is pretty extraordinary when you think there's such richness in this tradition, but all boats are being raised at the moment. And last month, you may have seen John Creedon's musical Atlas of Ireland on RTE1 on Sunday at 6:30 p.m, which is a prime spot. It's actually this time, isn't it? Yeah. And in the very first episode in this new John Creedon series on music in Ireland, there is a focus on the early Irish harp. And I'm just going to show you a short extract. I just videoed this from the RTE player on my phone, so the quality isn't perfect, but it will give you a good idea. No. am I doing wrong here, Lauren?
How far back?
Can I just go back to the beginning? Yeah, okay.
But why is the harp so iconic? I'm here at the National Museum of Ireland to meet Siobhan Armstrong, who is taking me to their secure storage unit, where some of Ireland's priceless treasures are kept. So Siobhan, how far back into the mist of time does the Irish harp actually go?
We don't actually know.
No?
We know that they were playing it by the 1100s when the Normans showed up because they were entranced by what they found. They understood that the Irish harpists were incredible.
Funny, I hear you say the word harper. Is it harper or harpist?
Oh, I suppose I'd call all of the men and women who played in that tradition, I'd call them harpers. I mean, I'd call myself a harpist.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have the nerve to call myself a harper because I'm not fit to tie their shoelaces.
Wow,
You know what I mean?
Siobhan was certainly fit to play for Queen Elizabeth II and the Duke of Edinburgh when they made their historic visit to Ireland and Trinity College, where she played a replica of Ireland's oldest harp, the Brian Boru. We learned in school that the harper had genuinely a very, very high status within the Gaelic household and court.
Gaelic society was incredible in that after the G or the king, you had the filler or court poet. The third most important person was a musician, was the Clitra, and later he was called the Clorchor, the harper. He was an illustrious tradition with high art music objects and incredibly sophisticated music from the early Middle Ages until it died out, in the 1800s. We're very lucky that the National Museum of Ireland holds this incredible collection, the biggest collection of early Irish harps. I think 9 harps out of maybe 18 in total that survive in the whole world. So this is a late 17th century harp, and it was built for the Earls of Kildare, the Fitzgerald family. It's a typical Irish harp, if you like, in that the enormous resonating chamber, the sound box, is built out of a single tree trunk. It's got the wire strings, the brass wire strings.
Those strings, they're hard work, are they?
Well, they played them with their nails. For most of the history of this instrument, all the way into the 18th century, harpers played with their nails.
Actually, there's those old Celtic spirals there as well, so it kind of very much screams, this is a Celtic instrument, this is
I'd say it's an Irish instrument. Celtic is quite a big word, but it's an Irish instrument. So from these islands.
Yeah, so it's unique to the Gaelic people, I guess.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
brilliant,
exactly.
brilliant. And you know, funny thing, Siobhan, when people talk about stringed instrument, people seem to forget the harp all the time, and yet it's so graceful, so dainty, and there's something very regal or something, isn't there?
This is the high point of Gaelic culture, of Gaelic musical culture, for over 900 years.
It's quite the showcase of the harp on primetime TV. The high point of Gaelic musical culture for over 900 years. That's what Siobhan said. John Creedon said something regal about it. It feels to me, when I watch things like that and when I see the profile rising all the time, it feels to me that the harp is gradually regaining this certain status in Irish society. It has musical status, but it also has political status because it represents a deep aspect of our culture. And we can take the benefits of this, but obviously we need to be conscious of it because in the movement for, I don't know if you've noticed this, but in the movement for reunification of the island, the organisation Future Ireland is now using the harp as its logo. And that could go either way for the harp. It's the one symbol that the two communities in the north actually share because it's on the flag of the royal family and it's the symbol of the Irish president as well. So if there is reunification, I wouldn't be surprised if the harp is part of the symbolism. But that, I don't know what we think of that. So I could give you many more examples of these major changes for the harp that are happening and that I see happening all the time. Awards for harpers, new music, new albums, new groups, the first concerto for harp and orchestra commissioned by RTE Lyric FM. And I know that Harp Ireland has ambitions to build an international centre for Irish harp in Dublin, which would raise the profile of the instrument even further. So as regards the harp, over the past 10 years, when I look at what has happened, there's a huge amount to be positive about, and all credit has to go to the harping community. But like I say, the harp is just one part of our music scene. And in this talk, I want to go back to these 3 significant developments that I'm interested in. And I mentioned earlier on that some very, very unexpected things happen in the arts in Ireland. And one of the most surprising things that I have seen is the introduction of a basic income for artists pilot. This single initiative has the potential to have a transformative effect on music in Ireland. Now, if you are not aware of the basic income, it's called the BIA. It's a pilot scheme that was introduced when the pandemic struck. It was brought in by Minister for Arts Catherine Martin of the Green Party, and it began in August 2022. Now, the Greens negotiated what's called a UBI, a Universal Basic Income, into the programme for government. And it was part of their policies before government, but they never mentioned arts or musicians or artists in their initial idea. It was when the pandemic came that Catherine Martin saw an opportunity there to pilot the idea in the arts. So now 2,000 artists. Are you all aware of this BIA that's taking place at the moment? Some of you will be aware of it, yeah. 2,000 artists and arts workers, people who work in the arts. 29% of them are musicians, almost a third, are receiving $325 per week for 3 years. The scheme is also being accompanied by a significant research project that includes a control group of 1,000 people. So there's 2,000 receiving the payment, 1,000 in the control group, and they are comparing the impact as we go along. Now, in the Journal of Music, we have been following this research really carefully. And I just want to show you some of the research that has popped up. Will I ever find it here? Yes. I know I should make it simple. At the bottom. Which one? That one? Okay. There we go. And just, what's the next bit? All tools. Sorry, this is a PC and I'm working on Mac, so that's why. Yeah. Lauren, come on up here. You can do it. Yeah. That's it. Okay. So, after 6 months of receiving the basic income payment, the research showed there was a 10% decrease in depression and anxiety. This one down here. These are other results, but this one really jumped out at us. After 1 year, artists had improved life satisfaction, spent more time on their work, produced more work, and actually spent 40% of the payment itself of the 325 on their artistic work. So a lot of that money went straight back into whatever they were working on. There is one other piece. There's lots of pieces in the BAI research, but there's one other piece that I wanted to mention because I think it's pretty extraordinary. After 1 year, the percentage of those in the control group of 1,000 who reported feeling depressed or downhearted in the previous 4 weeks has remained stable at 74%. See the column in the middle there? That's the people who are not receiving any of this safety net whatsoever. And then the people who are on the BAI is the 62%, 61.7%. They have 62% report feeling depressed or downhearted in the last 4 weeks. But the report also says that these values, and I quote, are extremely high and that the average for the general population is actually 32%. Now that's pretty shocking to me, and I actually know most artists and musicians, and even that amazes me, that the general population is at 32% and artists and those in the control group are almost double and over. So it just shows how important this BAI is and the impact it's having, and it shows how important it is that it actually continues. Now, all of the government parties are making positive sounds regarding this pilot. And when I talk to artists who are not in the pilot, they are really betting on this being expanded. It will solve a lot of problems for them. And there is this assumption now that it will be expanded because in the recent budget, the government allocated 35 million towards the scheme. But things may not be as straightforward as we think. The current pilot expires next August, and already Fianna Fáil, the Green Party, Sinn Féin and Fine Gael today have committed to continuing it, assessing it, looking at it. If it is expanded and it has the same percentage of musicians, say if it was doubled, there would be 1,160 musicians in Ireland receiving a basic income of 325 per week. Their lives would be better. They would produce more work. There is an assumption based on research in other countries that it would put them in a position to take more risks in their work and be more entrepreneurial. So the knock-on effect could be pretty extraordinary for music in Ireland if this is continued. So it's possible to imagine we're heading towards some kind of utopia if all the political parties are saying that they're going to continue it and we have seen these kind of benefits. Where is that going to bring us? But we have to remember that the basic income has been trialled in other countries like Canada, Finland, and Australia, and in each case they cancelled it. They cancelled it because of a new government, an economic downturn, and results from the research that didn't meet their expectations. So we don't know what the expectations are when it actually finishes up next August. So I'd like to show you a video of artists who are currently on the BAI discussing it, and you'll notice once again the harp, the centrality of the harp here.
Today in Dublin city centre, many of the country's leading Irish artists and organisations gathered to discuss a wide range of issues affecting their sector. And the first bit of business was the publication of the first in-depth report on the impact of the Basic Income for the Arts pilot scheme involving 2,000 artists. The headline results indicate a positive impact for the group.
We can see that they're able to spend more on their practice, €550 per month, which is like 40% of their basic income is going on their practice itself, be it materials, be it advertising, be it marketing, be it spaces, artist spaces.
Other headline findings establish that basic income recipients are spending 8 hours a week more on their practice and work fewer hours outside the arts.
Just having dedicated funding for 3 years, it was a huge safety net to that. This has had an amazing effect on my life and my family's life. Our quality of life has just increased, and our stress levels have decreased, and the work has improved, and I've really got to focus on what I do, and it's working.
Minister Martin also expressed her hope that the policy would be included in future Green Party manifestos. She hoped too that politicians would support the pilot and extend it to others.
I think we are a nation who value our artists and who are lucky in the standard of artists that we have in Ireland, and it's what we promote worldwide is that creative sector. And I think this is a signal to all that not only are we proud of them, but it's time to really value them by helping them to create.
While there are many other topics discussed today, the main call was for ongoing support for the scheme. Evan O'Rourke, RT News, Dublin City Centre.
Okay, I haven't heard the BAI discussed in the current election campaign. If Catherine Martin and the Greens do not get into government, I wonder what that will mean. I'm not sure who's going to champion this scheme in the same way as she has, who's taken ownership of it. That is the first significant challenge that faces the music and the art scene over the next year. All the sounds are good, but I have seen over the years when real commitments are made in manifestos, and once it goes into the programme for government, everything is up for grabs and things can change. And we saw that when Leo Varadkar promised he was going to double arts funding and then very, very quickly changed his mind. He was forced to do it when the pandemic came, but if the pandemic had not came, we would be in a very different situation. So that's the first challenge that we face, that BAI sustaining it. The second challenge that I want to talk about is actually the complete converse of the BAI. It relates to the Irish music industry as a whole. The BAI scheme, and this is never ever talked about, is an emergency measure. It is an emergency measure because artists are on such low incomes. It's a social security net to protect those on low incomes. But the question has to be asked, where is the plan to lift artist incomes up? Where is our ambition in all of this for our famous music industry that we are so proud of and that we keep talking about? We are focusing on the social security net at the bottom, but not on the actual building the music industry as a whole. So this was really drawn to my attention 4 years ago in the Journal of Music. We published an essay by a Paris-based Irish writer named Gareth Murphy, and it was called How to Transform. I'm going to try this again. Yes. Yes. No. Yes. Okay. Menu. Sorry, I'll get this. What was the next one? View. And then full screen. Okay. We published this essay 4 years ago by Gareth Murphy. Now, Gareth, his father is a former manager of the Bothy Band. He's worked in the electronic music record industry in Paris, and he's the author of Cowboys and Indies, the epic history of the record industry, a survey of the last 100 years. He is an expert on the music industry. And his music business articles in the UK, he won Writer of the Year for his music business articles. He wrote the notes for the vinyl re-release of Paul Brady and Andy Irvine's album, and he was nominated for a Grammy. I don't know how many music writers, I don't think he's the first music writer from Ireland to be nominated for a Grammy, for sure. So Garrett's diagnosis of the Irish music industry was very, very simple to understand. He said that globally, the music industry is divided into two things: live industry, record industry. Very, very simple. And it's 50-50 around the world, basically, the money that goes into both sides of these. But the balance between the live industry and the recording industry, it varies from country to country. But what Gareth was saying in his essay was that almost nowhere was more lopsided than Ireland. We have a live music industry with big companies like MTD and Éireann and Live Nation, and we have the concerts and the festivals. But our indigenous record industry is tiny. It's very, very small. We don't have the indie culture that other countries have, that the UK has, for example. And then he goes on to make a very significant point. He says that because we don't have a strong native record industry, all the world-conquering music we think is Irish is actually foreign-owned copyright being sold back to Ireland from the UK and America. And he has a phrase for this: it's copyright drain. Copyright drain is what is happening in our music industry, and that's why we have sort of rock warlords and buskers, and what Garrett says is nothing in between. We have a live music industry, and it disguises this. But this is Garrett's diagnosis, and it means that successful Irish music today is signed to UK and US labels, and therefore the profits, this is the whole point about it, the profits from those UK and US labels, it is recycled back into their countries. But we don't have an indigenous record industry where the profits are recycled back into the next generation in our country. And if you think back to the 1970s, when we had indigenous, a little community of labels like Claddagh, Gaelin, Mulligan, we are still benefiting from that. And it is brilliant to see that Claddagh Records is back now. But it is still, as far as I can see, pretty much a part-time venture. It doesn't have a lot of staff. It's very much on its own. Gaelin, we don't know what's happening with it. Mulligan is gone. There are tiny labels and none of them have any staff. So when Garrett's article was published in 2021, it really resonated with people in the Irish music scene. This is what Steve Wall said from The Stunning. If you're interested in how the Irish music business could be better read, read this. It's a great read and echoes my thoughts entirely. Garrett's solution is quite simple. Like we do with so many areas of our cultural life, we need something to help our independent record labels. He describes labels as like beehives. They are hives of activity that involve all sides of the music industry. Music is inherently organizational, he says. Nobody can do it alone. Labels are the heart pumps of the whole commercial ecosystem. Now, labels have had a bad rap, you see, in the streaming age, and everybody thinks that they don't make money. They do make money. They do make money because they're at the heart of the commercial system, particularly the major ones. But it has become possible again because of streaming for actually indie labels to develop their business model again. But what we are doing at the moment, instead of actually thinking about labels, is we are investing in individual artists, and we are providing literally millions of euro to individual artists to release albums on their own and do all of the legwork. And almost every single one of them has to become their own record label and learn all of the skills of running a label from scratch every single time. It's just not the way to do things. And we've somehow allowed that happen. And this is a key issue in music. Gareth published his essay 3 years ago. Last December, the Arts Council published a new music policy. They say they're going to commission research into the commercial music industry. No such research has been commissioned. That's what I say. Things have slowed down. There isn't the urgency these days that there was maybe 10 or 20 years ago. If it is commissioned next year, then we will hopefully see a focus on labels, and that could be transformative. But once again, unless the music community is actually asking these questions, talking about these issues, it just won't happen. So these are two big issues for us. And finally, The last issue I want to focus on relates to music and arts throughout the whole of Ireland. And I want to start by playing a video. This is a montage that I put together from my trips to the Achill International Harp Festival in 2017 to 2019. And this festival, like Harp Ireland, it began in 2016 and it very quickly established itself as an international festival for harping. It was founded by the brilliant harper Leisha Kelly, and it had an amazing voluntary committee. It was on the island of Achill, which is almost shaped like a harp, so it just worked on so many levels. And there was a creative magic to this festival. There really was. Particularly when I look back on these videos, I can see it. So have a look at this video, and we'll talk about it afterwards. And you can see some of the unexpected things that happen at this harp festival. I can't remember where they're from, South America, but it was just a range of music that they had there. Looks like an interesting festival. Yes. That festival is now gone. The pandemic was difficult enough for that festival, but ultimately it was the workload on a voluntary committee that made it impossible to sustain. It's closed in 2021 after 5 years. Last week, I heard that another harp festival is not taking place next year. You remember Siobhan Armstrong in the John Creedon show earlier on? Last week she emailed me and she told me that for the first time in 23 years, Scoil na Glárseach, the only festival of the early Irish harp, which takes place in Kilkenny, will not take place next year. Again, this is about fluctuations in funding and the stress involved in a small committee working for very little for a long time. It's just not sustainable. And I also recently heard last month that the Galway Early Music Festival is not going to take place because its funding has been refused, and it's the same issue with East Cork Early Music Festival. Now, there are lots of reasons why events and organisations end. Nothing lasts forever, obviously, but we have to look closely and see what is happening. And you know, after the pandemic, I was sort of looking at all these amazing funding decisions and the extraordinary work of Catherine Martin to raise the Arts Council funding from 80 million to 140 million. But I was also suffering from this psychological condition called cognitive dissonance, that is holding two different points of view in your head. I was aware that the art scene had finally won its argument about its funding breakthrough. It had happened. And we were, in the Journal of Music, we were covering these announcements all the time. But I couldn't help notice the little signs, the festivals disappearing, artists leaving the scene, organisations and venues shutting down, it didn't make sense to me. It didn't seem to get easier for most people. But recently, I started to look at this. As I say, these things come across my desk all the time, and I started looking at this a little bit closer. Is it that one, Lauren, that I press? Yeah? Okay. No, it's gone again. Yes, there it is. Okay. Okay. View. Full screen mode. Okay. In recent months, I started to look at this a little bit more closely, and I began by looking at the Arts Council figures and where they were spending this extra money since 2020. And if you add it up over the 4 years since that pandemic struck, it is actually 264 million extra compared to what they were on previously. This is an extraordinary amount. But when you look at the figures, and I want to focus here in the first instance on the Arts Council's strategic funding scheme. And I'm focusing on that for very specific reasons. It is the biggest pot of funding that the Arts Council has, as you can see here. It is 50 million, or 37% of its total budget. But 50 million, the strategic funding, 70% of that funding is going to organisations in Dublin. The next largest tranche of funding, this is 14.6 million. That's spent on arts grant funding, which is for smaller organisations, and then 6.5 million on arts centres, 3.8 million for county councils, and 3 million for the Festivals Investment Scheme. And you could go on, there are schemes that cost less, creative places, creative schools. There's lots of funding going around the country, but this is the big pot, and 70% of that is going to Dublin. Now, there are reasons for that. It obviously has a larger population, 29%, not 70%. There are also organisations there with a national remit, but it's very different having a national remit and actually having events and organisations on the ground around the country. It's a very different thing. If you want, in the arts in Ireland, if you want access to significant long-term funding as an arts organisation, you need to get into that category. The average grant in strategic funding this year is 465,000. For organisations in this category, it's around 80,000. It could be the difference. So you can see the difference. If you're in here and you're getting the average grant, you could have 6, 7, 8 staff, conceivably. If you're in here and getting the average grant, you could have 1.5 to 2 staff. It's less sustainable. It's more perilous. And that's what's happening outside of Dublin in the majority. Even when organisations from outside Dublin make it into strategic funding, their combined allocation is dwarfed by Dublin organisations. In 2024, Galway and Limerick both received just 6% compared to Dublin's 70%. Cork received 5% and Kilkenny received 3%. There was 8 counties that didn't receive any of that funding at all, any of that strategic funding. They do receive other funding, obviously, but the strategic funding is where it's at for sustainability. So I bring this up because all of the organisations that I see disappearing are around the country. This doesn't explain everything, but I think it's part of the picture. If the majority of new funding is going to Dublin, which because it is so expensive is probably swallowing up a lot of the increase and there's limited return. Meanwhile, in the rest of the country, there is not the same investment. So I published an article about this a month ago, and funnily enough, the Arts Council rang me on Friday. And the communications officer said to me that I was being disingenuous by focusing on strategic funding. But you can see that I have very, very clear reasons for focusing on this. It's the largest pot. And the average grant, almost 500,000. It makes a big difference being in there. Thankfully, Harp Ireland is in there, and I'm delighted to see that. It allows an organisation employ staff and build for the future. Everything else is precarious. So the communications officer of the Arts Council also sent me the overall figure as a counter-argument, which shows Dublin. This is the documents that the Arts Council sent me on Friday. And it shows, it was meant to counter my argument, but I actually don't think it does. It shows that 53% of the total of all grants is going to Dublin. Not 70%, 53%, but you can see that the rest of the country is on rather small amounts. And once again, these could be individual grants, these could be small grants. It's the strategic funding that's the important one. So, I have called for, you can see this is a further detail on the funding. You can see what happens when you break it down. Overall, Dublin 52%, and then it rapidly drops. Cork, Galway, Limerick, Waterford 2%. You know, that's, I went to college in Waterford. There's a big art scene there. It's a radically different situation in all of the 25 counties. Carlow, I have no idea how they have an art scene at all when this is happening. So this is a radical disparity in our art scene in Ireland. And it's a strategic misstep. And with so much strategy and discussion and planning, I'm amazed that this can happen. But we have to actually talk about it. So I've called for the Arts Council to set up offices in Cork, Galway, and on the border. I don't see any other way unless we actually decentralise. Otherwise, we will keep seeing these green shoots appearing like Achill, and then disappearing again. And everything, I see this coming across my desk all the time. It's happening all the time. So they are three significant issues for the future of Irish music. I think that's what we should be focusing on. I don't hear much discussion about them, certainly not during the election. They are big, big issues for us over the next couple of years. I call this lecture, What Next for Irish Music? And I hope I've given you something to think about. The BAI, the independent record industry, and the decentralisation of funds. I hope you find these thoughts useful. Thank you very much.
And I just have to say that, of course, Harp Ireland is very grateful for the funding it receives from all of its funders, on Chorla Ali and the Arts Council and the Heritage Council, which I should have said at the beginning. But I thought maybe you'd like an opportunity to respond to Toner, get involved in the discussion, seeing as he has been quite provocative and obeyed his instructions. So, Toner, anybody like to ask him a question? I'm just waiting for a mic here. Toner, you're definitely much taller than I am. Yeah.
Hello, testing. Mic is working.
Great. Thanks very much. Anybody like to make any comments, ask Toner a question? Toner, do you want to come over to the mic? Because we are recording this. Yeah. Any comments, questions? Yeah. Gary Dunn.
Thanks, Toner. Enjoyed that. On Garrett's article about the music industry, does he give any comparable markets, other countries that are doing it right? Because obviously the UK and the US aren't comparable.
Yeah, he talks about Sweden. There's a big section in the essay all about Sweden and the sort of culture they have there, focusing on the indie industry. You know, it's like a 4,500 word essay. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Anybody else?
I'm sure you've all lots to think about now.
I don't want to get this bogged down in a funding discussion, having been on the Arts Council for so many years, but I'm going to hand over to Catherine Boothman from the Arts Council.
Well, actually, I have a question. It's just another thought. So, what are your thoughts about things like, income from the streamers and taxing every sale of an Apple computer in Curry's, or things that might build on what used to be in the old days. In France, they had the blank tape tax, for instance. What about those other kind of incomes that could be redistributed back to as independent streams to artists and small organisations?
Do you mean the government putting taxes on streaming in Ireland?
Yeah,
I think,
or even an international movement that could be solidified as a process of where the money is being made on foot of the creative work of artists, but it's being made by multinationals. How to get a more significant chunk of that back through the copyright and neighbouring rights associations.
Yeah, when I think about things like that, that's a political movement that needs to take place at EU level. But we have to think about this entrepreneurial. We can't wait for the EU to start taxing the big techs. They're going to be battling with them for years. We actually just need to support labels and actually release that sort of entrepreneurial spirit and get them to start generating income. There is money in streaming, but not for individual artists, unless they're huge, obviously. They need a little community of artists to balance out the incomes. It's just like book publishing. You take some risks on new artists and you also publish established artists. And that's how you build a business model. But at the moment, all of the little labels I know, all of them have actually stopped working on it and they've just gone into day jobs. So I think it needs to be both. Yeah.
Going to hand over here to Mary Louise O'Donnell.
Thanks, Tona. That was a fascinating presentation. Lots of food for thought there. 10 years ago, and I still find it amazing that it was 10 years ago that the report was published, you made all the recommendations. Moving forward 10 years, are there any specific recommendations that you would make to the harp community for the next 10 years? I know that's a tricky question, but even a couple of recommendations.
Out of the ones that I recommended 10 years ago or new ones? I think the main recommendation that I would make to the harping community and to Harp Ireland is to start to get together with the rest of the music community and actually build up some sort of coalition. I really, really think we need that, because it's easy for me to say it here, these things, and then these thoughts, but unless the music community, and we did try during the pandemic, we established Music Alliance Ireland, but once again, we're also busy with our other worlds. It's very difficult to build up that kind of momentum. But the music scene and Harp Ireland, Irish Traditional Music Archive, Napiber, Yillin, Music Network, we all need to be part of the same movement. And that's the way we could actually start to address these big issues. Yeah.
Thanks, Mary Louise. Anybody else? Comments? Yes, Jamie. And I'll come to David then, isn't it? Yeah.
Thanks, Donor. I'm going to sidestep any policy queries, and I might just ask you. It was really interesting to see the video of Bono and the harp being used, and it kind of sounded, for one of the rare times I'd hear it, to have some kind of electronic kind of effects going through it. And it's just more of a question about the idea of the traditional arts and the future. They seem to be kind of at odds in one way, but through your work with the journal and so on, could you kind of expand upon how you see maybe the traditional arts being kind of, thrust into the future through electronic music or streaming platforms or things like that?
If I'd had time, there was one video that I didn't show, which was, I don't know if you've heard of the artist Una Monaghan, the harper Una Monaghan, who is the most adventurous electronic artist. And what she does is she puts touch-sensitive gloves on when she's playing the harp and has recordings, other types of recordings that respond while she's playing the harping. I mean, there's that type of innovation happening in harping. That's what's fascinating about it. It is the full gamut of musical tradition at work there. So it is actually happening in harping. I would recommend Una Monaghan. I wish I'd played her today. I just didn't have time. Yeah.
And we have another question over here, David, isn't it? Sorry, I'm going to have to weave my way in here. Thank you.
Thank you, Turner. That was great. I'm involved. I founded the Boyle Arts Festival. I'm on the committee with the O'Carolan Festival and the Joe Mooney Summer School. And the basic problem is very simple, is the committees have got older, the second generations are taking over, and most of the people are even sort of cynical about even applying to any funding because they've been refused so much. The O'Carolan Harp Festival got €2,000, and it's not even listed on Roscommon County Council as a festival.
Is this the one, the Carolan Festival in
Keeju?
In Keeju,
yeah.
Whereas the one in Nobber is now gone.
Correct.
Yes. Okay.
So I'm just bringing the attention that whether Keeju
I
remains
think that's another...
Well, your point is exactly correct. And I mean, I'm on the committee, so I know.
What I would suggest is that you move to Dublin and you'll have a better chance of...
Well, that's what we were thinking.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Can I just say, in relation to all the funding and the funding distribution over the many years, I had the privilege of serving on the Arts Council for 10 years. I'm not beating the drum necessarily for the council now, but I think the absolute eye-opener for me in my time in the council was that the ask exceeded what we had to give always by about 60%. And anybody here who sat on these peer panels would probably agree. The ask was always much more than we had to give. And I'm just thinking 60-30 or whatever. So there is, that is a huge compliment and a huge affirmation of the incredible activity that happens in Ireland from a creative point of view. So just to put that, Gary, I'm going to hand it over here.
It's more a comment than a question. That might be an interesting ask to going back to your comms person at the Arts Council to look at the same map for applications. Because I assume what you showed was what was given rather than the applications.
Yeah, but that would also reflect the fact of whether or not there's actually an infrastructure out there. It's impossible to build an arts infrastructure around the country if 70% is going to Dublin. It's just impossible. It just won't happen. And if there isn't an infrastructure there, you know, in Clare, Waterford, Limerick, giving artists opportunities, encouraging them to go forward in their career, they're not going to ask for anything.
However, you will agree, Toner, that there is a very large infrastructure of arts provision in the regions, as in every county now has an arts centre. So that probably is, it's 36 or 38 art centres now that we have all around the country. They're funded by their own local authority. There are arts offices in every local authority, and there are Creative Ireland offices funded by government in every local authority as well.
Yeah.
There is a Culture Ireland fund which sends artists abroad, and I think the major action that was taken during COVID was the Arts Council actually changed its direction and funded the individual artists to help artists survive right throughout the pandemic. And that's how we managed to get that increase. So, you know, I think we can't forget all of that very positive action and affirmation of what has happened from an institutional point of view. I couldn't let it go. I'd hate to let people go home thinking that nothing was happening, because there is an awful lot happening. I'm going to go over to Teresa O'Donnell here. I really, as I said, don't want to get bogged down in the funding discussion, because we'd still be here at midnight if we do. But let me hand over to Teresa.
Sorry, this is just a kind of a follow on from Éireann's comment. I suppose one of the great things about Harp Ireland is that it's all island, and it's regional, it's Dublin, it goes absolutely everywhere, which I think is a credit to the organisation as well. That it's every single pocket of Ireland, in every county, in every town, in every village. And I think that's wonderful for the organisation.
Thanks very much. And again, just on the Harp Ireland thing, what that has enabled us to do is be that all-island organisation in terms of where the harp is positioned historically and presently and currently in Ireland. It's really, really important. And Lauren is here, is our CEO from Derry, is testament to that fact that there is so much happening in the north. So it does work on we are certainly not on the 450 grand, which you say is the average, which is totally skewed by the national remit and the very, very large organisations who exist in Dublin and who also go out on tour and bring it out the country. But it's really important for Harp Ireland to have that national reach. And I'm delighted that we do have that national reach. And I think in our Harp Day, which took place about 3 weeks ago now, we had over 100 events happening countrywide, because I went from Dublin to Clare to Galway, to Roscommon to Foxford. I was going to go to Cavan, but I was so exhausted I came home. But that was even just a span in one half day's activity. So I think, you know, we're doing pretty well. And it's not that I'm dissing anything you're saying, Donor, and everybody out the country has an equal right to as much funding as they need to make the greatest art and to encourage as many artists as they possibly can. It's let's get the cake larger.
Can I just make one response to
over to you?
Just to finish, I think that is all true, because I travel the country all the time and there's magnificent things happening all around. And I realise that the Arts Council's funding is a huge part of that. But I would just remind people of that bar chart that I showed there. If 70% is going to Dublin, you will not see an infrastructure grow up around the country. It just won't happen. Yeah. So
can I then, has anybody other comments they'd like to make? Because if not, I'm going to say thank you. Míle buíochas the tóna ach den Éireann Ibre a chuir sé stacha an lecture an sár obair a tarsúil agat ó bhliain go bliain ag taú na nálíonn go handúil in Éireann. A big thank you to Toner for his advocacy, the work that he does for the arts, his book that he has published lately, and particularly his support of harping in Ireland. And I'm delighted that we were able to give him this invitation to speak to you here today on looking at the broader spectrum of the arts in Ireland and that the challenges he has set down. And there is a gathering of artists in the Gate Theatre on Monday at 1 o'clock,
so, yeah.
run by the National Campaign, isn't that
Yeah.
right? For the Arts, where I think most of the politicians are going to be speaking. So this is our chance to go and make our case and make our presence felt. And I've no doubt you'll be there.
I probably will be.
Yeah. So, gur mille mágad.
Míle fáilte.